Hi, I'm Eli Ben-Sasson, and you're listening to BlockSmart, my pod where I talk to smart people about the blockchain, the world, and everything that connects them. Our guest today is Peter van Valkenburgh. He is a legal expert on the intersection of regulation and U.S. constitutional privacy and speech rights. He testified on these topics before the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. He's also the executive director of the nonprofit organization called Coin Center, of which Starkware is a proud supporter. He's one of the most eloquent speakers on the topic of blockchain that I know of, and he's a world expert on banana coin. And if you want to hear the banana coin story, keep listening. Okay, so Peter, our first topic, I want to talk to you about the surveillance, KYC, and the Bank Secrecy Act. And, I'll start by saying that I find it as a non-lawyer, non-legal expert, I find it very weird. In free society, we are all used to not having our mail opened and being able to talk on the phone with others without, the government listening in, unless, of course, a judge authorizes it and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. When it comes to our finances, it's the complete opposite. It's sort of every transaction that we do digitally is sort of by law is supposed to be scrutinized by the bank and then reported. And it's very, very strange, this setting. So I want to ask you, how did we find ourselves in this sad situation?
You may ask yourself, how did I end up in this country?
Yeah.
So it's a great question. And it's one that Coin Center, my organization, spend a lot of time on because we're interested in civil liberties, but specifically civil liberties at the intersection of new technologies. And it'd be nice if we were starting from a baseline where we were just trying to protect the level of privacy we have with our homes online, right? That's part of your question is like when police want to come into your home, they need to get permission from a judge who is not in the prosecutor's office, who is some neutral third party. Ideally, it'd be someone who's rather like you, like this idea of citizen democracy and juries and judges being like this discrete part of the government that can play an important role checking what could otherwise be tyrannical discretion from an executive or even a Congress, right? And so that's the Fourth Amendment ideal, but you're right. We're not starting with that when we're talking about electronic transactions. Somehow we ended up in a world where by the time we started doing all our transactions online, electronically, all of the actual teeth of the Fourth Amendment right in the US to have no warrantless search was already gone for online transactions. The story of that is sort of a mixture of just path dependency. So you can't really, I think it's wrong to think that there's some sort of like malicious entity within the state that's like the Eye of Sauron that's trying to destroy us or destroy our privacy, because some of it is just where we started and how it evolved and how nobody stepped in and said, hey, wait a minute, this is a bad idea. This isn't something we should want in a free and open liberal democracy. So back in the 1970s, the US passes this law, the Bank Secrecy Act that you mentioned. And that law says that banks, they already have a lot of records about their customers. They should make sure they're keeping really good records about their customers, name, address, and such. And when they make a transaction, when their customer makes a transaction over $10,000, they should report that transaction to the government. And not even just any $10,000 transaction, specifically transactions in bearer instruments like cash or checks, negotiable instruments, where we lose track potentially of like money in the global economy.
So objection, like why, how come this came to pass? Like why is it that anything over $10,000, the government needs to see a report? Like, didn't anyone scream?
A lot of people screamed. And there were two big Supreme Court cases. If people are interested, they can check them out. It's California Bankers versus Schultz and U.S. versus Miller, where people, including the ACLU, actually, which was a co-plaintiff in the California Bankers case, said, wait a minute, my relationship with my banker is something that's private. Like, they owe me a contractual duty of privacy, and they shouldn't just be sharing my information with the government willy-nilly. And unfortunately, those cases didn't turn out well for privacy advocates. In fact, the ACLU got kicked out of the lawsuit because they couldn't prove in the lawsuit that they, as a customer of a bank, had ever been subject to one of these reports. So the judge said, you don't have standing to challenge this. And it wasn't until you got to Miller, who was a bootlegger, he was making moonshine and renting equipment and making bank transactions to rent equipment, that he's the guy that represents our liberties to not have bank surveillance. So sort of bad facts make bad law. Would have been much better if the judge was looking at the ACLU as like the plaintiff or the challenger of this law than this guy who's like a questionable bootlegger. But unfortunately, that's how law tends to get made. And so the court said that once you hand your information, like your records, over to a third party, you lose your Fourth Amendment right to assume that that will be protected against warrantless search. And to me, that is crazy. But back then, it was a little less crazy than it is today. Because if you think about in the 1970s, how often did you use a third party to do a lot of important things in your day-to-day life? At least with financial transactions, not that often. You'd maybe, you'd take your mortgage out, you'd buy an expensive car, maybe you'd get some, very big transactions through your bank, but most of your day-to-day transacting would be with cash, which leaves no record for anyone, which means there's no third-party search of your cash transactions. There wouldn't even be a record to search. And so back then the balance was bad. I agree. I think that the court should have gone the other way in that case, and it was a really close case actually, which
Yeah, I was going to ask if there's any way to challenge it again and say, yeah, can we think about it again? Maybe can we reverse that? Is that even allowed, like with
totally
Supreme Court
allowed.
cases?
I mean, there's the principle of stare decisis, which says that once decisions are made, they should be settled. But as many listeners will probably already know, like in the US, we've reversed some pretty substantial decisions without even
Abortion.
distinguishing. The Roe v. Wade example was probably the primary one. But here you don't even need to fully reverse because the deciding opinion in those cases, it was like a really split court, said, we're saying that the BSA is constitutional only as applied today. And so in the 1970s, that means that you only get a report without a warrant when it's a giant transaction, $70,000 or more in today's money, not a $1,000 transaction, not all of your records. And you don't have suspicious activity reports back then. You don't have all of the record keeping obligations that we've accumulated under the same statute since then. So as applied today, it's definitely a panopticon, we're going to collect every detail of every transaction you ever made type statute, whereas back then it wasn't. So you could just look at that opinion from the deciding justice in the concurrence in California Bankers and Miller and say, well, actually, that doesn't say that what we're doing today is constitutional. It says only as it was back then.
When I have a very strong feeling that if you look at any objective metric of crime related to,
Yep.
money and try to isolate the effect of the Bank Secrecy Act, I would conjecture that there's no noticeable reduction in crime. Like a little bit like
Yeah.
the war on drugs or things like that, where, there's something that's supposed to have a good purpose, or so we were told, right? To stop illegal use of money and a lot of bad things. And if you look now, it's more than 50 years later, you'll probably not find any evidence that, noticeable reduction can be attributed to that. Is that the case? Or are people saying, no, look, the Bank Secrecy Act made us, there's no more terrorism, there's no more illicit drugs, or whatever. It's been a reduction in that. People don't pay for homicides anymore. Is there any research either way about this whole thing?
So we have done the research at Coin Center because this is an important issue for us. I'll put a disclaimer up front that the social sciences are not like the hard sciences. We can't run repeatable double-blind trials on things. It would be unethical and impossible with something the scale of the whole economy. But all the data that we do have about the costs of implementing the Bank Secrecy Act versus the actual achievable deterrence of crime shows that it is one of the most disastrously clearly failed policies in all of sort of modern financial regulation. So I sound like a crank, right? But my data comes from two sources on this. The UN did a study. The UN is a fairly reputable body for these sorts of things. Did a study and found that of all the illicit money traveling through the economy, only 0.2% ever becomes blocked, frozen, or interdicted thanks to know your customer and anti-money laundering rules. 0.2%, a vanishingly small amount of the criminal money in the system actually gets frozen. And this is not just the UN. FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, actually has a similar sub 1% number. So vanishingly small results. Now, I want to pause because that sounds very damning. And I think it is, actually. But a reasonable reply to some of that for people who think that this is a good system to keep in place is, well, the system isn't actually designed to identify and seize criminal funds in the system. It's there to put up a big barrier, a wall, a deterrence that prevents criminals from ever using the system. Now, unfortunately, there's some arguments against that, which is that actually the size and scale of the illicit economy is huge in the financial system. So it doesn't seem, but maybe it'd be double what it is. You know, some estimates are 20, 30% of the underground economy that mostly travels through bank transfers. But maybe it'd be, I don't know, 40, 50% or 60. Maybe states would just collapse because no one's paying taxes anymore and everyone's just doing under the table business. I think that's kind of extremely cynical. And then the other thing I'd say is, all right, this deterrence effect, are we deterring the right people? And I think the reality of the BSA and anti-money laundering policies, as we see them implemented today, reveals that we're deterring exactly the wrong people.
Oh yeah, I'm certainly deterred, and all of my friends are like deterred from moving even, funds from one of my bank accounts to some other bank account that belongs to me.
Yeah, people forego transactions because they're troublesome. Many people don't open accounts because the actual, barrier to entry there is pretty profound. You're going to have to go through this massive onboarding process that seems very personally invasive, and you'll often find your accounts frozen or blocked erroneously. And so I think we're deterring tons of either low sophistication or time-constrained ordinary people who are just trying to live their lives and should almost have a right to be able to make financial transactions, let alone have this huge barrier to making financial transactions. And then on the other side, are we deterring the really sophisticated entities? I hate to say it, but probably one of the most sophisticated entities when it comes to financial transactions right now is the team within North Korea that does cyber attacks. And it's not just in crypto. They were the ones behind a very large bank infiltration in the Central Bank of Bangladesh. They created fraudulent transactions to the Fed Bank in New York, and they ran away with tons of money there. And of course, there's all these crypto hacks as well. And, are we deterring the Lazarus Group from accessing our financial rails? I actually don't think so. Are we deterring international drug rings from accessing our financial rails? I don't think so, because what they can do is buy tens of thousands of legitimate seeming identities off of dark markets and open accounts, providing all the documentation that we are forced to collect on ourselves with basically no cost. And so the system right now imposes costs on people who are trying to do good things in the world, and it imposes fairly little cost on international criminal who's operating at scale.
Maybe it gives like this barrier of entry to new cartels or new bad, new villains.
Like, actually, one of the things that the president's task force on money laundering in the US has been doing that's actually pretty good lately is focusing less on people who are building software for transactions in crypto and people who are building good privacy tools and things like that, and more on international crypto money brokers for cartels. Because the cartel is just going to hire someone, even if it was a brand new cartel, right? And they're going to, like, if they're doing well as a cartel, I don't know the cartel business, so maybe I sound a little silly here, but I'm assuming they're going to find and hire the best at, being their money broker. That person is still a real person, though, and they are a money broker. And so this is, to me, is a reasonable use of our unlicensed money transmission laws and the other laws to crack down on that type of activity. And so there is a way forward here. It's more like good old-fashioned policing. Like, find that guy who can explain to a cartel how to abuse the system and arrest him. Don't use these broad laws to just surveil ordinary Americans. Don't use these broad laws to go after software developers who are just trying to build better systems for ordinary Americans or ordinary people to use.
So, Peter, you go first, then I want to answer. So, like, suppose, I don't know who it is, the Supreme Court or the president comes to you and says, look, Peter, you're really smart. How do we prevent criminal activity without harming privacy? Like, you get to rewrite whatever it is, scrap the Bank Secrecy Act. What do you put into effect?
I mean, I'll give you a perfect world answer and a pragmatic answer because
Okay.
I want to give two. In a perfect world where I would just get my
There's no
druthers, I can
crime,
do whatever I
so
want.
nothing to stop.
All right, so the world's not totally perfect because there's stuff to stop. But like in a world where I have unlimited, I'm a dictator, which is a terrible idea. I don't want to be a dictator. But what
I
would
think
I
you'd
just
be a nice dictator.
choose? Maybe one of the better ones, but power corrupts. So I would definitely repeal the third party doctrine, which is this idea that once you hand your information over to a third party, you no longer have the protections of warrant requirements for searches by the government. And that would be a massive shift at this point because we've ended up in a world where our financial system assumes that banks will collect all our information and report it to the government without the government even having to ask. And if the government does want to ask for some additional information, they don't need to go before a judge and prove that there's reasonable suspicion. I think that is inherently against all of our core values in the Constitution. Justice Gorsuch on the Supreme Court has suggested there was a case about cell site location data, like how Verizon knows exactly where you are all the time because your cell phone pings the towers. The majority in that case, the opinion was written by Sotomayor, said this is too much. We have to have an exception to the third party doctrine wherein if the third party is collecting your full location history through all time, that's still subject to a warrant requirement. So she had a narrow holding. It's a good holding. I agree. Justice Gorsuch wrote a concurring disagreement saying, like, I agree with the outcome, and so I'm voting yes. But in my world, this is actually a pretty direct paraphrase. I would take the third party doctrine off life support. He recognizes that even the liberal justices are skeptical because this is very damaging to vulnerable persons. And he's like, what? This is ridiculous. In the law of contract, if I bargained with a business for privacy, a third party to that or a fourth party would not be allowed to just learn stuff about our private relationships. We'd be able to sue that person. So why can't I sue the government for doing that without due process as well? That's, to me, my ideal solution, is getting rid of that third party doctrine. My pragmatic solution is in a world where we can't fully repeal the BSA because of political entrenchment and where the Supreme Court is only willing at taking little bites out of it. Can we do some serious harm reduction in the way banks onboard customers and what we call an anti-money laundering program? And for that, I think there is a lot of promising work to be done in user sovereign ID, wherein I amass credentials from people who will vouch for me. And then I use something that you know far better than I, zero knowledge proofs, to selectively disclose certain things about myself based on those attestations that I've gotten from other people. Like, see, I am over 21 according to 3 different documentations that have been provided to me of my age and birth date and identity. And I'm going to prove that to you without actually showing you my name and my social security number and my home address. You could do things like, I can prove to you I'm not on this list of sanctioned persons by, the US government. I could prove to you that I have an account in good standing at 3 different financial institutions, so you don't need to recollect all of my personal information just to allow me to transact. To me, that would be a harm reduction. That would be important and a good use of some of the technologies that people like yourself have pioneered and finally put into practice.
So I want to give my version, which, I agree with you. So if I'm appointed the dictator or, asked to rewrite the
You'd
law.
be one of the good ones too, Ellie, I think.
Thank you.
One of the better
we
ones.
could, we could split terms or something. Dictators
we'll
like
have a
to
little
do
alliance. That. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I would go with a version of your second suggestion, which is to completely ban banks and others from keeping your data beyond the immediate necessary, and certainly not being able to share it unless they have a specific warrant. And I really like the way that, if I understand correctly, the U.S. tax system works, in which, you're asked to report and you may be audited, but for most of the people, most of the time, they report honestly, and this is a very efficient and also empowering system. So what I would do is I would require, it's along the lines you said, would require people to constantly self-report to themselves, but in a way that they cannot negate on their actions. And later on, in order to be in good standing, you would need to prove in zero knowledge that, whatever was the latest requirement of good standing, you abide by it. So for instance, that over the past year, none of your transactions went to addresses that then were associated, even post fact, with criminal activity. Now, if you can't generate that proof because maybe you were cheated or fooled and you did
Yeah.
one of those transactions, or maybe you were hacked, it doesn't mean that you're kicked out forever or sent to prison. It means that in this case, in order to get your good standing, you would need to go one step further. And I don't know, maybe, at first get a letter from an accountant, or you wouldn't need to reveal it to someone else of your discretion in order to get back your good standing. But the basic thing is that for most of the citizens, most of the time, you just can prove in zero knowledge, revealing no information, that you were in good standing. And of course, you could still be subpoenaed for, let's say, random audits and everything like that. In addition to that, I think so. Basically, sort of emulating the tax reporting system in the world of all of your financial transactions, and you're supposed to show that you are a good citizen.
I like that a lot. And, you and I haven't actually discussed this before. It's a very interesting approach. I normally would hesitate to mirror anything about the US tax system, but the self-reporting aspect of the US tax system is actually sort of a bastion of liberty. One thing that we have to fight off a lot when we talk to people in Congress or people in the executive agencies when they're asking questions about crypto is, well, if we had fully anonymous, bearer instrument like crypto for lots of transactions, wouldn't people just stop paying taxes because maybe they get paid their wages and we can't see it anymore? My response to that is that's just unlikely and strange, actually, because, people live in the real world. And I have, for example, I have a fairly nice house in Washington, D.C. I'm very lucky to have this, nice row house in a nice neighborhood. If I have that and I'm not reporting any income to the IRS, then yeah, I'm going to be an audit target. I should be an audit target. And that's where good policing and law enforcement should be doing their job, right? Not hoovering up tons of information automatically about everyone, assuming everyone's a criminal, but making the fairly obvious observation that someone who seems to have a lot of income or a lot of wealth but can't explain where it came from is probably, a criminal.
And but also, I'm guessing, I don't know how long the federal tax reporting system goes back, but I guess it predates the digital times when probably everything was done, one person to the other. And if you kept records, they were with carbon copy and stuff like that. And if people haven't been evading taxes, the federal government and the states were able to collect taxes probably since the revolution or whatever, and way before computers. And as we all know, over the past 250 years, the United States has been doing pretty well, including its government. So it's been able to collect taxes and prosper.
Yeah. So to get into the maybe reasonable counter argument here, there is, I think, a legitimate claim to be made that, yes, systems used to work like that. Yes, we used to do a lot more through good old-fashioned policing. And then that would also include things like warrants, because if you have specific suspicions, you can take them to a judge and get specific search orders. But all of that's a lot of work. And what's happened since the 1970s is we've started doing work in a different way, both humans as just humans, but also the government. We've started offloading the role of the state, which would be investigating crime, to the private sector in a fairly specific way, to the banks. We've said, you're going to be deputized to find suspicious people who are your customers and report them. And to a certain extent, just like people talk about how AI is dangerous because it's going to atrophy our brains and we're not going to think anymore, I think the Bank Secrecy Act atrophied our financial intelligence units within the actual government. And so people often look at me and they say, he's just a crazy libertarian who wants to destroy the state, make it so small that you could strangle it in a bathtub, which was an old quote. That's not mine. That's somebody else's. I don't believe that at all. I actually think we should be expanding state capacity to do law enforcement and anti-money laundering, because I want it done by the government in an accountable way rather than done by these unaccountable third parties.
It's not their alignment. Like, if you want to make money, it's not in your interest to,
this is something that should play well with more progressive liberals in the U.S. Is like, why are we giving these giant profitable corporations roughshod over our rights because of the fear of crime? Why not empower and fund the government to go out and do crime fighting?
Well, I think therein lies the answer. No, I mean, by now, to me, like, I live in Israel, and there was, I think, a law that wanted to be passed. I'm not sure, maybe it was passed, that cash transactions must be limited in size, like actual cash, paper money, to some, limit. And when I read that, I was like appalled because it was clear to me that this is all coming from the banking lobby in order to basically
Funnel,
just
yeah.
have more transactions passing through them and charge more fees, have more reports. So I think by now it's probably the banking system is very happy with being
Right.
able to charge extra for all
They,
of this.
they ended up aligned, even though they were originally misaligned with this
Yeah.
regulatory structure. They ended up very aligned because it creates a regulatory moat for them. It makes it difficult for you to open an account at a rival financial institution because you'll have to provide all this documentation again. It's actually very good for business once you build out your compliance department and are willing to spend all that money on things like KYC. It's a pretty great system for a giant non-competitive bank.
I once tweeted that like every case of a law originally passed to create an agency to protect a certain civil right over time
Mhm.
will be sort of, transformed into something that harms that very right.
Yeah, it's a strange phenomenon. There does seem to be a certain amount of truth to that. I do think a lot of it is strange path dependency and then pernicious incentives and not some sort of evil in the state. But you could write a compelling narrative that there is something rotten at the core. The last thing on this topic, the question of state capacity and how we need to build state capacity in order to actually do anti-money laundering in-house in the government rather than offboarding it to private corporations is, I think, especially important in the context that you and I were describing just now, which is like, can we leverage new technologies, blockchains, zero knowledge proofs, verifiable credentials? Right now, Coin Center is working on an initiative in this. We call it the John Hancock Project because it's the most famous signature in American history, the big one on the Declaration. And we're running into a problem, which is we either need to convince financial institutions to use these new technologies as an alternative form of customer onboarding. Like, they have no incentive to do that. They're
Right.
not going to stick their necks out in front of their bank examiners and say, like, oh, we don't know our customers anymore. We just know they're not terrorists. Because the
Yeah.
bank examiner is going to say, like, what? How? No, you're going to jail now. In order to get the banks or financial institutions comfortable with these new technologies, you need a signal from the regulators that it can be done a certain way. But that requires a sort of deep competency and policy making idea within the regulatory state as to what's possible and what's appropriate. Like, what should the risk calibration be? How many forms of digital ID and zero knowledge proof should score high enough that you can onboard this customer for tens of thousands of dollars of transactions versus just small transactions? Those decisions and those calibrations and understanding the technologies that can make them granular requires an amazing amount of competency within the US Department of Treasury and the financial intelligence apparatus. And I'm not saying anything bad about the people in those roles in the US. I think some of the people are some of my good friends and highly competent, but they are woefully underfunded. They don't have a mandate from Congress to do all this extra work. And they just work on a system that currently assumes that the banks will make these decisions internally, and we just have to threaten them with giant billion-dollar fines when we find out that they laundered a bunch of money for Russian oligarchs. This is a terrible system, and it can't move forward unless we actually make a real political push
Yeah.
to fund those agencies better and give them a mandate to do work in-house and not just assume that the old tools that the banks are using really just to protect their competitive advantage are sufficient.
I'm Eli Ben-Sasson, and you're listening to Block Smart, brought to you by Starkware. Okay, I want to talk about digital identity. I'll start by saying that I have this dream that one day national like fiat currencies, which even though I'm in crypto,
Mm-hmm.
co-founded Zcash and Starknet, so I'm associated with a bunch of digital tokens,
Just good digital tokens, though, Ellie. You've got the good ones.
yeah, yeah. I agree. But I still, I have no problem with fiat currencies, but I could still see the value even in a fiat currency that is, let's say, monetary policy decided
Mm-hmm.
somehow by the state. But here's how I would want it to be run. And I think one day it will be like this. It will be a proof of citizenship based. So a little bit like proof of stake, but each person has exactly one, unit of stake. A little bit like voting in democracy, one person, one vote. So one person, one vote on this big network of nodes. And then what happens is you have this sort of proof of stake consensus mechanism where the voters are your citizens, and minting of new tokens constantly goes to those operating the system, which are the miners in this thing, and they're just the citizens, or those of them who want to participate. And the point is that the only thing you need is a digital identity. You want the government to be issuing, and that's probably the only thing this agency should be doing, is issuing one citizen gets one digital token for participating in this and other things, and no more, and just maintaining that list. But like beyond that, you have this sort of beautiful network that is owned by the people of that country and which maintains its national currency. So what do you think about my use case for digital identity?
I love it. I think we don't spend enough time on the edge thinking about what's possible in making democracy technological rather than just institutional. We have a lot of talk about democracy, like the importance of elections, the importance of voting, the importance of a court system. And those are very important things. But those institutions today move so slowly and so inefficiently as compared with the emergence of big technology companies and big technology projects that they get often left in the dust. And so we end up having giant banks or giant tech companies like Google as proxies for our interests in really important public goods, like how we build our system of transacting, how we have our money. And you could do a lot to bolster democracy by building technologies of individual participation and sovereignty and autonomy that you can't by just having more laws and court cases about like voting impediments and other things like that. So I think this is a great idea,
What
but
would
it
you do with
also,
digital identity if it was formed in the US, for instance?
I mean, I hadn't heard your proposal until just now, but I would definitely love to push for your proposal because the stablecoin system as it exists today, or the CBDC system as it exists in China today, are two versions of a bad thing. You know, in the CBDC world, you have direct state control over all transactions and top-down complete surveillance over all transactions and total control over the monetary supply. So you have basically the perfect tool for a very small number of people within a country to control the country technologically. And the proposal you have is let's invert that. Let's give every individual citizen actual power, i.e., staking power, if it was something like a blockchain, in the system that determines their liberty and their fate. And the stablecoin system in the US right now, while better than the CBDC system that they're developing in China, it still has massive problems because it still empowers these large financial institutions. Stablecoin issuers are right now going through a rulemaking procedure at the Treasury to decide, like, when are they going to be obligated to freeze their issued stablecoins, even when they're held by people who are not their customers. But the monetary dynamics aspect of what you were saying, like direct to citizen seigniorage, like
Yep.
the people who get the benefit of newly created US currency, it really should just be the people. Because right now,
Yeah.
and this is where the Austrian economists are 100% right in a lot of the work they've done on monetary dynamics, people like Mises and Rothbard and Hayek. Money, when you create new amounts of it, trickles through,
Yes.
and the banks that receive the seigniorage in the form of, better interest rates to borrow from the Fed or from other member banks get the benefit of that extra money, and the immediate big customers who they lend to get the benefit of that extra money before it affects prices in the economy. Eventually that extra
Yes.
money shows up in the full economy, and now there's more money to the same amount of goods, and so your milk is $8 instead of five, whatever. Now it's like 10 now or something where I live. It's insane, for a half gallon, by the way. Uh,
Yeah.
and I didn't get that extra money until the very end of the chain. By the time it
Yeah.
had been reflected in the things like milk prices, I should be the first to get that money as an American. And the banks should be the last to get it. They should suffer the seigniorage tax. But
Yes.
it's a little
So
radical.
what to you is the most important thing about digital identity today? Like what would you like again if whoever it is, President Trump came to you and said, Peter, once you're done with the new bank secrecy version, why don't you write the law for digital identity? What would you do? And especially in the US where, right, you don't even need to have any sort of identity from the government at all.
Digital identities, it's scary. So we're already doing this work on digital identity for the BSA stuff that I mentioned earlier, which is in a world where you already are going to run into a big gate, like opening an account at a bank, The little coin that you have to put in the gate should just be a proof that you're not a criminal, not all of your personal data, which they will lose and it'll get hacked and it'll be used to open accounts in your name by scammers.
Hmm.
So if we're gonna have digital ID systems, they're scary actually. And I'll get into that in a second. But we might as well use them where we can do harm reduction, like having financial institutions collect less sensitive information about us and instead have some sort of digital ID proof that we are not a criminal. So I think that's where I want to see these systems built out. I am very concerned by proposals right now in the US, and there may be proposals in other countries, but I'm not as familiar, to require even operating systems, even open source operating systems like Linux and FreeBSD and the core infrastructure of our computing world to have at that core level age verification. And the claim is we need to have, Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Linux check and understand the age of the person using the computer, because otherwise that person's going to go and look at porn or look at content that will degrade their malleable mind, like social media is bad for them and things like this. And I actually agree. As a parent of young children, I worry a lot about social media. But to me, the idea that we would then force all developers of operating system software to build in age verification gates, that's a road to just full control over all computing infrastructures. And it's a road that people will find innumerable ways around. Like if it's an open source operating system like Linux, I'm just going to fork the distro that doesn't have the age verification in it and use it, right? But then the government will have to go, I guess, door to door and be like, are you using the right version of Linux? And then they'll have a massive job of whack-a-mole, and people will have a massive job of just being scared all the time because they just want to freely compute without having all this data collected about them. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about digital ID is, like, if we build these systems the wrong way, if we build them in a lossy way or a way that doesn't protect individual privacy, then we're going to build a panopticon. Like every time you check in to use your operating system, let alone a social media platform or a bank, they're going to have some sort of centralized record of all the things you do in your day-to-day lives. And we do everything online now. So it would be the ultimate panopticon tool for societal control if we don't build these things with zero knowledge proofs in them. And if we don't fight back and aggressively say, no, you can gate me when I go open an account at a financial institution. You can't gate me at the point that I want to install software on my computer. Like, that's crazy.
Everyone listening to this podcast came to listen for one reason, and that is to hear about banana coin. We cannot have this podcast with, I need more cowbell. So, do you want to tell the banana coin story?
I would love to tell the banana coin story.
Okay.
When you asked me to do this podcast, I was like,
is it, first of all, is it investment advice? Should we go buy banana coin?
This is 100% investment advice for your listeners. The demand for bananas is always increasing. And so if you can find a way to get in on that on the ground floor, you'll do well, my friends. No, this is not investment advice. I don't think anyone will think it is. It's pretty firmly in the realm of satire. But Ellie, I think one of the first times that you and I met in person, maybe not the first time in person, but like the longest time we spent together. And it was beautiful. It was a conference that you organized in Haifa. I think it was at Technion University. Yeah. And this was early. This is 2016, maybe 2017.
17, I think. It was the height of the ICO season.
Vitalik was there. Yes. Arthur Brightman, who hadn't yet developed Tezos or was in the process of developing Tezos, was there. Zuko, Zuko. One of the developers of Zcash, of course, was there. So this is a very formative moment for me because I was still fairly new to this space, like 3 or 4 years at Coin Center working on the legal issues around here. And you very graciously asked me to speak at this conference amongst incredibly talented cryptographers and developers about the law. And not a lot of people were talking about the law of crypto at that point in time. And Coin Center, that was our mission, was to start talking about it because it's important. And one of the big topics was, of course, banana coin securities laws, and what the SEC was going to say about all these ICOs, where you give someone your money and they say, yeah, I'll give you a really good token. It's going to be just like Bitcoin. You're going to earn, 100x return. And obviously, there's a version of that is no different than a typical unregistered securities issuance. The classic unregistered securities case in the US is this case called Howey. And the Howie case is about a guy who owns an orange grove. And he's like,
Orange Grove.
come,
I learned it from you. Yeah.
yeah, come to my orange grove. He'd have these rich tourists from New England coming down to Florida, and he'd show them the orange groves, and they'd be beautiful, and this would be romantic. And then he'd pitch the couple, like, you could own part of this orange grove. I'll sell you that back acre, and you don't have to do anything. I'll still pick the fruit, and I'll sell it at the market, and you can come visit the hotel, and you'll get all the profits. And so this is a backdoor way of selling shares of your orange business, right? If it's the combination of land plus a contract to make profits off the land. And so I'm explaining the Howie case because this is not that different than a lot of folks in crypto, where you say, oh, this is a really cool new peer-to-peer network. I'll build it for you. You don't have to do anything. You just give me capital up front and I'll give you a big share of the tokens in return. This starts to look a lot like the Howie test. And I was like, how can I make this even more obvious of a one-to-one connection? And I found in preparing for this talk, Banana Coin, which was at the time one of these zany ICOs. And I thought, well, this is fair game. Like, this is just one of the fringe ones. I think they claim to own a plantation of bananas in Vietnam.
Laos,
So,
I think.
in Laos, yeah. Just like Howie owning the orange grove in Florida. And they claim that like each token represented like a fraction of that plantation and its profits in growing bananas. And then the white paper and the website had all this stuff like bananas are hot.
Will go
Everybody
only
wants
up.
bananas. They go only up. Demand is always increasing for bananas. And so buy the token now and you'll get a share of all of our future bananas profits. It's bananas. And so I'm explaining this with like a grin on my face. Like I'm so clever finding this perfect crypto example to make people feel the reality of the SEC's potential authority here. And I said, I don't know who their lawyer is. I don't know who wrote their white paper, but I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. And a guy shouts from the back of the theater, I wrote their white paper. And it was a pretty well lit auditorium. I could see this guy. He was a guy I met in the lobby earlier. And he explained to me that he writes white papers on spec.
Or ICOs.
Yeah. Like people will come to him and be like, we really like to do an ICO. Can you write our white paper? And he's like, yes, I've written so many white papers. And so I immediately knew that this person was not kidding because I'd seen them in the lobby earlier. I got kind of concerned because I'm like a young lawyer and here I am. He's committed a crime, which could be a defamatory statement for which I could be sued, although truth is a defense. And I think they probably were doing unregistered securities issuance, so maybe I wouldn't be in trouble. But I kind of froze and panicked. And I also thought, I remembered him from the lobby. I was like, he's kind of a big guy. And I'm being glib. I didn't know he's who I was attacking. I thought I was attacking some scammer in Laos. And I was like, is he going to punch me in the face after that?
I think he was very proud. He was very proud of Banana Coin.
Yeah, he came down to the stage after the talk, and I was like, okay, now I maybe need to just run. He was like, I loved it. And he opens his bag.
And gives you a banana?
What's in the bag? Is it bananas? Is it a gun? It's a T-shirt with a giant banana on it that says Banana Coin. And he gave it to me. He was like, I would love for you to have this and wear this in Washington, D.C. And it's actually in the dresser next to me. I won't try and find it right now. I should have dug it out. But to me, it's one of my like most treasured souvenirs from my early work in this space. And it just goes to show you that this is a ridiculous but also amazing space.
Yeah,
people are going to do weird stuff. Unfortunately, some of it is abusive and should be policed. But
one thing to his defense, what is the number one produced fruit in terms of tonnage worldwide consumed all over?
Is it bananas?
Bananas. I never thought like, I thought they have like a short half-life or something, but bananas it is. So, if you're going to make a coin, it's not going to be for orange. It's going to be for bananas. Anyways.
In his defense, in another way, I don't think people should buy Banana Coin, but there is something wrong with the way we do equity in businesses, right? We've decided that you have to go through a very costly process of audited financials and hiring very expensive lawyers just to become a publicly traded company that, say, owns an orange grove or a banana plantation or anything else. And that is a real barrier. And so you don't actually see very many newly incorporated public companies in the US. You see people just saying, I won't be a public company. I'll just be a privately owned company, a closely held corporation, because then I don't have to comply with these very expensive disclosure rules. And what that means is then the really good businesses that start in the US, also the ones that are fly by night and fail, but the really good ones, the only people who get in on the ground floor are the accredited investors who are allowed to buy and sell shares of non-public stock. And that is a pernicious
Yeah.
anti-egalitarian or it increases wealth inequality basically, because it means that the only people who get the upside of good stuff is Mark Andreessen, and then your average person, maybe they're protected from scams, and that's important, but surely there was a better way of protecting them from scams than denying them access to any early stage investments. Leave me alone. I should be able to buy this company's
So
stock.
TLDR, those of you who do want to invest or create a banana coin, maybe at some point in the future there will be a way. Again, stated sarcastically, this is not legal or financial advice. Now that we're done with the serious part, banana coin, a bunch of fun, quick questions that I always ask my, the people on my podcast. Which Broadway play is your favorite?
Ooh, Broadway play. I think Cabaret. I love Cantor and Ebb's music. It's just gorgeous to me and also fun. I guess this actually says something about me because it takes place in Weimar, Germany, when everything's falling apart. It's a terrifying time, but also a time of like great experimentation and beauty, and you just hope that it doesn't turn out the way it did in Weimar, Germany. But that's a play actually about, a cabaret and nude dancers and love and then also ultimately the oppression of a disgusting state. So it's got everything I want, and the
Okay.
music's great.
Sounds like the present. Your
Yeah,
favorite
scary.
TV series?
Ooh, favorite TV series. My wife and I actually, this has been a boon to our marriage. We have very similar tastes in television, which means we end up watching a fair amount of TV. I sometimes wonder if I watch too much TV. I love The Leftovers, Damien Lindelof. It was on HBO. It's about a world where, and I'm detecting a pattern as you ask me these questions, where the rapture
Falling apart.
happens,
The what?
but it's not
Oh,
the Christian rapture because it just seems everyone, from what everyone can tell, a completely random set of about 2% of the population just disappeared, like out of their clothes. They're just gone. And the story is not about that. It's about how society deals with the sudden revelation that the universe is, there's far more complexity and chaos in the world than dreamt of in their philosophy, to quote Shakespeare. And it's completely undecipherable. It's not like the Pope got sucked up and like, oh, clearly the Catholics are right. It's like bad people got sucked up and some of us are still here. We're the leftovers. How do we make sense of the world that doesn't make sense anymore? It's also just a very beautifully directed show with excellent music again.
again, sounds to me too realistic. Um, if you could time travel, would you go to the past or the future, and why?
That's a hard one because all my work is about the future. Like I want to know how it turns out. I also think like my interest in the future is more about recreating the past. Like I want to build peer-to-peer electronic cash that works more like the dollars that people used to walk around with and pay for things.
Yeah.
I'd love to go back and talk with the founding fathers.
Your first job ever was?
My first job, like my first career, I had like odd jobs, right? I used to help my mom in her preschool. She was a teacher, and I'd help with the summer camp and things like that. But my first career was acting.
My mom was a teacher
Um,
also, but I was never asked to help.
I don't know what that says about you,
Oh, it says a lot.
but my first career was in acting. I tried to be a working actor in New York City for 3 years, and I did some off Broadway things that were not worth mentioning. But it did prep me very well for things like congressional testimony and just being confident in public speaking and things like that. So I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Okay, I think we covered all the important topics, the banana coin included. So thank you, Peter, for coming to my show, my podcast, Blocksmart. And that is all for today. I want to thank Peter Van Valkenburgh, Executive Director of Coin Center, for joining us today on Blocksmart. I really enjoyed this show, and I want to thank all of you for listening in. Now, if these topics, things like zero knowledge, privacy, blockchain, interest you, please consider reading my book. It is called Zero Knowledge, Infinite Trust. You can find it on Google or you can go and order it on the website blockchainthebook.com. That is blockchainthebook.com. Read it, leave your comments. I would love to hear them. So, thank you for tuning in to Block Smart. I hope to see you around the block, and do stay smart.